Mute. Thank you for having me back. I think at first I was requested to come back for part 2, and it was going to be the same exact agenda, but just talk a lot slower the second time. So, but there were some very specific questions that I was very happy to come back to, and this really is a topic that can easily be split over 2 presentations or a couple days worth of training. And I think I want to keep coming back to that point. This only has to be as complicated as you want or need to make it. So we're going to end this with some very simple and practical steps to go through and create a simple control chart. So this is the agenda we'll go through. We're going to do a little bit of a review of the last session, and you'll see there's a great segue that's going to lead me into my first set of slides where we'll review, and then we're going to go into Pareto charts and then P charts, which was one of the big items from that last meeting. And then we're going to end with some practice, and we're going to make a control chart from scratch. So to take the step back to review, and I referenced the book in the slide, so I'll touch upon it again later, but the book that I reference most often, that's where the definitions word for word are coming from. It's a Joint Commission resource book. I can't stress so much how useful and helpful that book is. It's almost like a workbook. So it's a great resource if people want to take that more detailed or more involved step. So data, clearly defined and meaningful. Data are facts, clinical observations, measurements that have been collected and put into some sort of order, but they haven't yet been interpreted. You'll hear people often call it raw data. Information is when you add some context and understanding. It's when you take that data and you start to put it into the form of a data grid or a table of something that has passed that validity test. So when you're going through things and you see that you have only a couple hundred discharges instead of a couple thousand discharges, someone might have missed a 0, or there might have been some misfeed from a system. So it's taking that data that you can get out of anywhere and then turning it into information. Doesn't mean that you've done the full analysis on it. A big part of data presentation is before. You don't want to be greedy with data. As much as you can turn out in a digestible format to other people, and then you can take that step back and do that next level of analysis. But it's great to try to get information in people's hands as soon as possible. Not necessarily data in people's hands. You do want to take that initial first pass to make sure things are accurate and at least understandable. And then lastly, indicators, which is a term, again, that the Joint Commission uses specifically in this workbook, and they use it in a lot of other places. But it's appropriate and explanatory. It's used to determine over time an organization's performance of functions, processes, and outcomes. People are probably familiar with the Agency for Healthcare Research and Quality, AHRQ, the patient safety indicators, PSIs, or the inpatient quality indicators, IQIs. But those are examples of measures that have exclusions and inclusion criteria to set a level playing field as you do analysis. And I'll have that debate. No, it's not a debate, it's an academic conversation that people might look at some of those indicators and say, I want to see hospital-wide this. I want to see, and they might want to be more inclusive or more narrow, which is fine and which is great, and there's a lot of different ways that you can look at and roll and calculate data. But the purpose of an indicator is that you can go hospital to hospital, state to state, organization to organization, and at least know you're looking at the same thing. And that's when you have that rigid set of inclusion and exclusion. So I would never say to use the indicators in a vacuum alone without any other information or any other types of reports. But you really should look to try to at least include some indicators within your other measure sets just so you have that benchmark comparison. So that is a quick overview. Now if you remember last time, we did some charting and we did some histograms, and I threw an arbitrary list of 5 hospitals up there, and I graphed them on pneumonia 30-day all-cause readmission rate. What I didn't mention then, and again it provides a great segue today, is that this is actual data. So I went into the Hospital Compare website, the CMS Hospital Compare website. I downloaded the database. This is analysis that I did just for this presentation of 2,000 hospitals, and I looked at the pneumonia all-cause readmission rate as reported, and I grouped them into 5 hospital groups: Hospital A, Hospital B, Hospital C, Hospital D, Hospital E. So there's about 2,000 hospitals that I've categorized. And you'll see that it does look like a great chart. It's what you might call a staircase. That's not an accident. but I didn't group these into these A, B, C, D, E based on their pneumonia all-cause readmission rate. I based it off something else. Now, the next slide, it's the same hospitals. This is showing you the number of hospitals that are in each group. So on this slide, I'm showing you what the hospital group's readmission rate is. And in this one, I'm telling you that there's about 1,600 hospitals in Group C, and there's about 300 or a little bit more than 300 in Groups B and D, and there's less in Groups A and E. This is what I called the bar chart a histogram. People might be more familiar with this. People might hear it called the bell curve. I'm going to spare you flipping back into that actual bell curve with all the different statistics on it that usually makes people dizzy. But the point of it was that middle group, Group C, it's going to usually have about 67% of that sample. So now what I'm revealing to you is I grouped these hospitals into these categories based on another measure, not readmissions, but another measure. And what I did is I took that measure and I took the average and I took my one standard deviation, and I pulled all the hospitals that were within one standard deviation of that measure, and I put them in Group C. Then I took all the hospitals that were better than one standard deviation, but not as good as two standard deviations away, and I put them in Groups B and D. In Group A, and then you've got Groups A and E, which are more than two standard deviations away. Now, here's the interesting part, and I don't know if anyone has guesses or people want to maybe try to flash up on the screen. So again, let's go back to this slide. Here are 5 hospital groups, A, B, C, D, and E. Each group has a different number of hospitals in it that I put into these groups based on how these hospitals did in their HCAHPS discharge information survey results. So on the surface level, you'd hope and you'd like to assume that how hospitals do on discharge information in some way correlates to how hospitals do with readmission rates. It's certainly not the only factor that would help with readmission rates, but it should be a factor. And the fact that it should be a factor is that's why CMS would make those regulations and make hospitals go through that and then survey patients. So it's assumed to be important, and then I wanted to actually test, is it important? So what we're looking at right now, going across the bottom in the gray bars, you've got the different scores. So the far left bar, there were 32 hospitals that got a 90 on their HCAHPS discharge information score. And then the next bar is there's 57 hospitals. So it's that number in parentheses, if you can see. There were 57 hospitals that got an 89. There were 100 hospitals that got an 88. And it goes numerically all the way down. So that's each individual score on HCAHPS, and then how many hospitals fall into that score. The red line you're seeing is charted now on the right axis. It's the readmission rate. So this is, again, from the same set of 2,000 plus hospitals in Hospital Compare. I took the hospital's HCAHPS discharge information score. I threw them into groups based on their discharge information score. Then I took those same hospitals' readmission rate, and I charted that on the right axis and that red line, and this is the pneumonia readmission rate. And again, it looks pretty cool. That was, and this is what you'd hope was the case. And then I'm going to do the heart failure readmission rate. So you'll see the same trend. You've got the green line going up. So what this is telling you, starting from the far left, hospitals that had the highest discharge information score had the lowest readmission rate. And as you keep going to the right, you'll see the 20 hospitals that had a 73 on that HCAHPS question have the highest readmission rate. If people are familiar with that HCAHPS question, it's a yes or no. So were you provided discharge instructions at the time of discharge, and it's yes or no. So what we're looking at is the percentage of people that answered yes. And then finally, here is the pneumonia readmission rate. So you've got going across, you've got the same type of trend, and then I'll end it with the average of those three. So we just saw the three individual, but again, it just tells you more of that story. So that was my segue into this one, into this presentation. What we've just looked at, and we looked at 4 of them in a row, is called a Pareto chart. A Pareto chart combines an analysis of frequency or other quantity of a problem with analysis of its causes. It will tell you which of the various causes of a problem are the most influential and which are less important. That was the Joint Commission definition. I do like to, and I'm not ashamed or embarrassed of it, I do like to go to Wikipedia, and this is Wikipedia's maybe more simple definition of it. It's a type of chart that contains both bars and a line graph, where individual values are represented in descending order by bars. And that was how I did it. It was the highest score descending all the way down to that far right. The left vertical axis is the frequency of occurrence, but it can represent cost or any other important unit of measure. And the right vertical axis is the cumulative percentage of the total number of occurrences or total cost or anything else. Don't get caught up in the specific definition of what a Pareto chart was intended to measure or what it does measure. Go off the second big bullet, that Wikipedia definition. A Pareto chart is a type of chart that contains both bars and lines. You're going to put them on 2 different axes, and I'll show you how to do that when we do our control chart sample. You're going to put them on 2 different axes, and one's going to be a bar, one's going to be a line. Hopefully what you're trying to do is show as something decreases, something else increases. Now, people might not have heard of Vilfredo Pareto. That's who, again, the Pareto chart is named after. But I'm sure everyone has heard of the 80-20 rule. That 80-20 rule was something that Joseph Juran, isn't that the Deming company? He's likened to Deming. He's probably just as big or maybe the second place to what Deming is to people as far as statistical process control. He suggested this I want to say in the 60s when he was in Japan working with automobile manufacturers, and he credited back to 1906 when Vilfredo Pareto said that 80% of the land in Italy was owned by 20% of the population. So that is really the birth of that 80-20. You might not ever, and that's why I made it a point to say don't get hung up in the definition of that 80-20 rule. You might not have that awesome scenario of you've got something on the far right of your Pareto chart that represents 20% of the population, and then you look at the line and they represent 80% of that numerator or 80% of the fallouts or the defects. That is like an ideal perfect instance of how those numbers match up. You might see other instances that a Medicare population might represent 20% of your discharges, but they might represent 40% of your days or 40% of your readmissions. Those are examples of things that would fall out in a Pareto chart. Doesn't mean they're always going to go down to 80-20. That's a very extreme measurement, but it's something that there's a disbalance between how an entity did in one measure compared to how they did in another measure. The key component on a Pareto chart is, if I just jump back to this one, it's ordering your bars in descending order from that left to right, or from right to left, bigger to smaller or smaller to bigger. But the point is, you might have units in your hospital, or you might have services that you very often would sort alphabetically on a chart like this and show everyone their individual scores. That might be very valuable, and as you go month over month, it might be good to have that alphabetical sort so everyone knows which unit or which service is where. But if you're looking to correlate how a unit does or how a service does within a certain measure against another measure, grab that same list of units or grab that same list of services, sort it based on that first metric, make a bar graph out of it, and then have that same unit or services score in another measure, and you make that the line. If the Pareto chart works, or if there is a correlation, it'll be visually obvious. Like, again, I think these charts are visually obvious that there's a strong case that for the better you do in discharge information, scores, and HCAHPS, the better you might do in your readmission rates. I was pretty excited when I saw that correlation. I like when things work out like that. The Pareto chart is one of the 7 basic tools of quality control, and I think what I did is when people were asking about P-charts, I didn't want to skip over Pareto because when we look at that list of the 7 basic tools, I don't know if people have heard that 7 basic tools, but it's something that started, I want to say, in the 60s, in the 50s or 60s. It's been quoted in a few different books. I referenced probably the last biggest book that it was articulated in, that 7 basic quality tools, the Quality Toolbox from the American Society for Quality. But the 7 tools are a cause and effect or a fishbone diagram, a check sheet, a control chart, a histogram, a Pareto chart, a scatter diagram, and stratification. And the stratification is just another way to say a flow chart or a run chart. So you can see that we've covered a lot of the different analytical tools within this, within that list of 7. So I didn't want to skip over and not include Pareto because it is near and dear to my heart. And everyone knows the 80-20 rule. All right, so now I can do questions at the end if it's easier for everyone, so we can come back to Pareto if people have a question. But now we're going to jump back into control charts. So we did some control charts during the first presentation, and we'll end it with the same control charts that we looked at. We're going to build some of those. There's different types of control chart, and people were asking about P-charts. P-chart is a type of control chart. So there are different types of control charts. There are different types of data, and there's really 2 main types. We covered this. I think I reviewed it quickly at the beginning of this presentation, but in that last presentation, and again, I think it's Chapter 1, Page 1 of the Joint Commission book, 2 types of data. Variable data or continuous. It's a quantity that is measured along a continuous scale, such as time, temperature, number of patients. Attribute data is a characteristic that something either has or does not have. Color, size, gender. It's typically a binary system. A yes or no, a plus or minus, a did they have post-op PEDVT, did they not have post-op PEDVT. Which control chart you use depends on which type of data you have. And now when I say that, you could assume to go forward and use the control charts that we are going to do today and what we did last time. It's a general control chart, and I'll show you what they call it in a few slides. You're less likely to go wrong if you just do the basic chart, and if you want to do a P chart, use that same data or try to evolve it into a P chart. There's a better chance that if you try to just start at that P chart, that the data that you're using and the data you're trying to put into the P chart doesn't accommodate or doesn't fit the P chart model. And what will happen is it'll be misleading, and I've got some examples of it. It might show you that you're doing very bad or very good, but when it comes down to it, you might not have what is truly attribute data. You might think it is, but when you get into measures that are per 1,000 and you get into some cases have a higher likelihood than something else, a true binary system is flipping a coin, heads or tails. There is literally a 50% chance of either one. Some of the measures that we look at in healthcare, they're not binary. It's not there isn't a 50% chance that something is going to happen and 50% chance that it's other. There's a lot of different factors that would make some cases and discharges more likely and some not. Depending on how much of a skew there is, what you think is attribute data might be more variable data. It might not be appropriate to use a P chart. So again, a P chart is only used with attribute data. It's used to keep track of the proportion of defective items in a sample of either varying or constant size. So it's more of a mystery than it probably should be. The P in P chart stands for proportion. This was first quoted and first used and first defined in 1931 when Walter Schuhart created the first control. He released a book in 1931. I have the name of the book. Yeah, Walter Schuhart in 1931 released Economic Control of Quality of Manufacture and Product. It defined a concept that he first did in 1924 while working at Western Electric and specifically at the Hawthorne plant. People have heard about the Hawthorne effect that originated at the Hawthorne plant, which was a division of a plant within Western Electric. But these are the people that really did invent a lot of these statistical process controls. So Dr. Schuhart was the first person to actually define the P chart, and the P chart was among the first 3 types of control charts that he used in that book. When I take you back to those dates, and the reason I said 1931, the first computer wasn't developed until the 40s. So when we look at these equations at the bottom of this slide, this was literally pencil and paper type of work. People actually using rulers to draw grids and write in numbers, do these equations and do these mathematical models time period by time period. There weren't spreadsheets. There weren't calculations or functions. There weren't things that are available now or even available 20 years after Walter Shewhart published this book. So what about P charts? When should we use the specialty charts for count data? So that I'm gonna be very honest. I ripped off that slide title. What about P charts? And then the first bullet. When should we use the specialty charts for count data? That is the title of an article written by Donald Wheeler, published in Quality Digest. It is, and again, I think this was sent out so people could find that article. That's a great article. The Joint Commission guide that I keep referencing goes over P charts very quickly, doesn't really fully explain P charts. There's a great table in this article that describes when you can use a P chart. Data characterized by binomial model, that was the yes or no, 0, 1, heads or tails, and then a variable n, so the sample size changes month over month or whatever that time period is. And I think that's when a P chart becomes most valuable. You might look at 2 scores for 2 different months that are very, very different. It might be HCAP surveys. You might have an 81 month and there might be 100 people that responded. And then the next month you might have a 50 or a 60 and you think, well, how did we drop 30 or 40 points? Instead of having 100 people respond, there might only have been 60 people that responded. So P charts are going to start building in that level of check on the population or the sample size to make it more realistic. That second table, so the article from Don Wheeler starts with figure 1 and ends with figure 5. All count-based data, no matter what. The XMR chart is what we did at that last meeting and what we'll do today. XMR is really the X chart. It's an X control chart. That's the most basic control chart. It's just a control chart. Don't overthink an X control chart, and people don't even really use that X control chart. It's just a control chart. That doesn't mean it's a P chart. The P chart is, again, a specialty type of chart. The MR means moving range, and that was we'll cover that in a little bit. But what that means is if you've got 3 years of data and you've got your standard deviation and your means and you've got a control chart, the next time you add another month of data, you may drop off the latest month, but you would recalculate your mean, your standard deviations. So that's all that means. It's the moving range. So this is an example of a P chart. The data is on top, the proportion of on-time shipments. This is again from that article, which is a great article. It's a great overview of P charts. The bottom of it, you'll see a little bit of a control chart. 91.3 is that middle line. That's the mean, and then 90.09 and 90. Those are the I'm assuming one standard deviation, but it's one set of control limits. That's a basic X chart. So you'll see at the bottom where it says figure 3, that's the X chart. The P chart element of this is you'll see the dotted lines above and below. That's the P chart that's adding in that very complicated equation that looks like this. It's building in logic for that. And if we can see, let me see how easy it is to point. I think people can see my arrow right now. If you look at these, if you look at the year 1 December, see how wide and how much that opens up in that month? When you look at the data in the table on the top, December 01, total number 113. That 113 is the lowest of all the 24 months. So in that month, if a data point was supposed to be significant or was significant, it would have to dip and go outside of the P chart range. Because the sample size is so small in that month, that range is less reliable and it becomes wider. So a data point for that month has to be that much different than other data in order for it to be considered significant. And you'll see other months that it gets very, very tight when you look at maybe February of year 2, you'll see the 270, that's the largest sample size. And you'll see that's where these dotted lines get the tightest in. What the article goes on to say is this is an example of when a p-chart doesn't work. These p-chart limits are too far away, they're unrealistic, and when it goes down to it, it doesn't fit the binomial distribution model. This wasn't a case of yes or no, heads or tails. Once plugged into the p-chart model, it doesn't fit. And a p-chart is something that you'll have in a statistics package and something that will be calculated for you. You might make inappropriate decisions and say that we're within range, but this is more of an indication of this data didn't fit the p-chart definition of the p-chart constraints. Now, another example, so it's a different set of data. You've got the red lines are the standard X chart, and then the blue lines are the p-chart element. Now you've got the p-chart limits within the regular control chart limits. I'll spare you the suspense. This is another example of the p-chart didn't fit within this distribution of data. It's almost a little bit unfortunate that within that article by Don Wheeler, he didn't actually provide an example of a p-chart when it was appropriate. What a p-chart was over the course of when it was first released in the 30s and used in the 40s and 50s. By the time we got into the 70s, 80s, 90s, and computers and spreadsheets were so distributed and so pervasive, they, I don't want to say became replaced, but it's not the first and it's not the go-to control chart. You really should start at that basic control chart. And there's ways that you could introduce the denominator in that population to get a feel for that size without actually going and creating a p-chart. So if you do want to use them, and if you have them, or if you want to, or if you think they're appropriate, I'd say, I don't want to say proceed with caution, but proceed with a little bit of caution. Bear in mind that don't take it on face value. Make sure you understand why it's telling you certain things, and keep in the back of your head that it might not be your data. It might just be your data doesn't fit that model that accommodates itself or lends itself to a p-chart. So that was my p-chart. That was my p-chart speech. And again, it's a great article if people want to look that up. And a p-chart isn't something that you can create easily in Excel. There aren't functions for it. You really would need like a QI macros or SAS or some program that was actually going to take your set of data and put it into a p-chart. So I'm going to pause. I don't know how we can do this relative to questions, or if we should dive straight into the demonstration and do questions at the end of that.
The conference has been unmuted.
We can take a few questions now, but only probably a couple, and then we're going to do the demonstration.
Okay.
We have questions so far?
Hi, this is Louise Clow, and I really don't have a question. He's explaining things beautifully, but I would love to see the demonstration to figure out how to actually do it. Then maybe we'll have questions.
Okay. If we don't have any other pressing questions now, we'll have Mary Ann mute the conference again, and Brian will move on to the demonstration of how to create a X control chart.
The conference has been muted.
Hello. All right. I'm sorry. I did the same thing. Now I'm unmuted, so I think people can hear me. All right. So this is the last slide in the presentation. So we're going to jump from this into Excel. So you might want to maybe keep a printout or a screen, but this is theirs, and I'll walk through each one of these steps. So I'm going to share applications. And thank you very much, Luis. That was very kind of you, and I've been looking forward, and I'm excited to get into the demonstration too. So here we go. All right, so this is a set of data. I'm in Excel. It's just 2 columns. I've got my months down here in ascending order, and I've got a score. These actually, it is an HCAP, so I'm not going to tell people what question it is, but these are actual scores. But this could be anything. It could be any type of rate, but I've got my score here. People might have data in rows, or if you want the data in rows, it's really easy. This is a really quick trick. You can go back either way. If I copy this and I go paste special, I can say transpose, and what it's going to do is it's going to take that data that I just had in that column, it's going to put it into a row left to right, and vice versa. You could, if you have data like this that you want to put in a column, highlight it, go somewhere else, paste special, transpose. Just so everyone can see the actual data in one screen, I'm going to leave it this way. So the first thing we're going to do, and I'm going to come over to the far right just so I have room. It's easiest to use the charting wizard when all your data is in one place. So I'm going to give myself, and let's actually title them. A control chart is going to have that score. That's the mean rate. It's going to have, we're going to do +2 standard deviations. It's going to have +1 standard deviations. It's going to have the mean. It's going to have -1 standard deviations. It's going to have -2 standard deviations. You might have to set and format these cells to text. I'll just show you really quick what I mean by that. Format cells, text. If you try actually using +1 and -1 in the cell, if it's general, it might think that you're trying to type in an equation and give you an error. Semantics, I just wanted to show you that I'm reserving 5 columns right now to have those 5 lines in the control chart with my rate. So now I'm going to come over here in column I, and I'm just going to type mean, and I'm going to say it's a Excel function. So let me show you the ribbon tool way. Formula, insert function, all, and it's the average. So just pick average. And I'm going to highlight that set of numbers. That's my mean. Let's just get that down to 1 decimal. So that's my mean. And then right here, I'm going to write standard deviation. So let's do the same thing. We're going to go formulas, insert function. I'm on all. So let's scroll down to standard deviation, STDEV. And now, same thing, I'm going to highlight that set of data, hit return. That's my standard deviation. I'm going to shorten that to 1 decimal place. So keep those there, and now we're going to come back over to here. All right. So I'll give people maybe a couple seconds to catch up if they're doing this in tandem with me. So I calculated those once because it makes everything else easier over here. So let's go back to +2 standard deviations. Well, let's work from the center, the mean. So just make the mean equal to that. I know, it seems crazy that I did it in 2 places. I'll show you why in a minute. This next cell, say equals, and point it at the first one. So it's the same thing. Just drag that all the way down. So I've got that same number all the way down there. I know it looks like a waste of Excel space, and it might seem like it doesn't make sense. I'm not suggesting that people distribute the raw numbers in this type of grid format. Like, it might be good to always print out the actual rates in the actual month, and people can look at that in a data grid, but I wouldn't redistribute like just the solid row of the same number. We're doing it for charting purposes. So now let's go to +1 standard deviation. This is going to be equals the mean plus 1 standard deviation. And then this is going to be equals that. And the same as I did with the mean, I'm going to copy that all the way down. And now let's go to -1 equals Point at the mean minus 1 standard deviation. And then this cell is going to equal that. And let's copy that all the way down. That might be enough for a control chart. You might just want to do +1, -1 standard deviations. I like doing the 2. So let's go back to +2, and we're going to say equals the mean plus, do open parentheses, because now I want to do 2 times the standard deviation. And then same as I've done in the previous times. Drag that down. And then same formula, but now it's going to be a minus. Equals the mean minus, open parentheses, 2 times standard deviation. And this is going to equal that. And the same thing, I'm going to copy that all the way down. So now I've got my month and my score that I started with, and I've just created now 5 sets of columns. I'm going to highlight that entire set, and I'm going to say insert. And you don't have to use the wizard. You can do it from scratch if you're more comfortable, or you might want to do this in a chart template you already have. But so I highlight the entire data set, and I'm going to say insert a line. There we go. So right now it just gave me this. It literally took those 5 columns or the 6 columns of data, months across the bottom, just so we could see more and we can actually play with it. I'm going to click inside that, and I'm going to right mouse click, or if you hit the little Windows key on your keyboard, the same menu will come up. And you're going to go move chart. I'm going to make a new sheet out of it. You can leave. You might want to leave the chart in the same spreadsheet. You might want to move it. This is just a detail. I think for the most part, and you'll see in a second, we created something to start with. I'm going to bring that down a little bit. I'm going to put these up here. And now, again, these are formatting things. To each is to own. You guys might have your own style, or you might want to do other types of things. I'm doing this right now to just kind of show you how to start with it. And you might, once you create a template, you might have a template and save it, and then just keep resaving it and plugging in new data. And every time you plug in new data, if you've got the same months, if you just take a different set of data and paste it into this column, all of these numbers are going to change. So if you've got a new set, like one, and so stare at the right columns. If I change this first data point to 25, everything changes. So create one, format the chart the way that you like it, and save it, and then use it as a template, and you can keep plugging data into that same one. You don't get the control chart look and feel of it if this isn't zoomed in. And with the control chart, people will always look at the axis of a chart and say, oh, but the axis isn't 0. You know, the axis, yeah, in a control chart, that's good. So let's look at the control chart right now. The red line is the most top line, so it doesn't go any higher than 80. And then the orange line, and see how this blue line comes down below that orange line, so nothing goes lower than 60. Click on that. There's a few different ways to do it. Once you've highlighted the axis, I'm a big fan of right mouse clicking. You can right mouse click, or if you went to format, you can get to it, or layout, you can get to it up here if you go to the axis. But I'm going to go and just right mouse click, format axis, and I'm going to say the axis options minimum. It's right now set to everything's auto, and then you see it's 0 and 90. Let's make it fixed. Let's make it 60. And we said 80 is failing, so let's go back here and say 80. And then say OK. So now you see you've got a much more zoomed in look. From here, this is when you can start. So that you don't really want that line red. You might want to, or you might not want to. But I mean, this is things that if you don't know how to do, you can easily find in Excel. Not what we just did. I don't think there's tutorials on how to create that control chart, but if you want to change the look and feel of this and make it look more like a control chart, click on any one of those cells, any one of those, like the lines, and again, either right mouse click or go up to, well actually, yeah, highlight it, right mouse click, format data series. I like to make my center lines gray, so line color, solid line, make me gray. I like that. And then I might want to make my standard deviations up and down. So let's say format data series, and why don't we make this a line color? Why don't we say solid line? Why don't we make it that gray? But why don't we make it little dots? And you might come back to this one, and we'll do the same thing. And then you can make these, a different color or dotted, or, there are instances that you might want to, depending on the measure. So this is a measure, it's H caps, higher is better. So instead of doing the same color for the control limits or the grays, you might want to take that top line, or you might want to take this line and make it green. And you might want to take this line down below the negative one, you might want to make that red or orange or yellow. Because the point is, going below there or going towards there is bad, and going up. That might be something you do to add that element of when people are looking at this type of chart, when they see green on top and they see the numbers near it, they know it's good. But there's going to be other instances when you're looking at a bloodstream infection chart that the green line is going to be on bottom. So you can color them how you feel, or you can not color them. But we're starting to look more now like that, type of control chart. Again, to review really quickly with the control chart, we've got about 36 data points. Statistically, 1 to 2 of those data points are going to fall outside of 2 standard deviations and vary at 2 points. You've got both instances, it's below the 2 standard deviations. There's nothing above 2 standard deviations. And so that's, and then there's going to be a 33% chance that things fall outside of 1 standard deviation. So that's when you get into, there should be then about 12 data points. So you've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 or above, and 6, 7, 8, 9. So fewer than expected fall outside, actually 9, 10, 11. So 11 fall. So it's about 12. But now, so this turns more into the control chart. And don't forget, these are always still run charts. You can always still look at the 7 data points going in the same direction month over month. There might be other instances of you've got 8 data points in a row above or below that line. But I hope I helped everyone kind of walk through this point. And this might be a good time for me to stop and take questions.
The conference has been unmuted.
Okay. Thank you, Brian. Do we have any questions?
No, this is Louise again. I don't have a question because I'm not smart enough yet to have a question. I'm kind of struggling with doing charts in Excel, but this is very helpful. I love to see practical examples. I have a simpler project, but it does have a bunch of columns and numbers, and I was trying to figure out how I'd get them all in one chart using Chart Wizard, and I got some ideas. Thank you, Brian.
Yeah. As a general rule in Excel, if you highlight all of the data that you want included in the chart and then go to the Chart Wizard, it will usually do what you want it to do.
Yeah.
The help wizards and the tutorials, I use them all the time.
Yeah, I've done some of the Excel tutorials that Microsoft has online, and I just need more practice. But it's really good to watch how you did this.
Thank you.
Hi, Brian. My name is Sue, and I have a couple questions. One is what you just did an XMR control chart?
Yes. Okay. This would be, now that's a great question. I'm going to jump back to the data sheet. The X and then the MR part of it would mean next month, when I add November 2012, I'm going to recalculate my mean and recalculate my standard deviation, and so all these lines are going to change. So that's the moving range part. So I'd say probably the most straightforward answer is yes, it is, as long as you're moving your range and you're moving your standard deviations and means with your time period. So this would probably be an X chart, and then depending on how you handle it next month, it would be an XMR chart.
Great. Okay. Thank you very much. My next question is, in healthcare, some of the things that we look at are things like falls or pressure ulcers or med airs, and they have various denominators depending on what your particular institution uses. How would you address this? Do you put a numerator and a denominator in and do the XMR chart on the rate, or what's the best way?
That's a great question, and you know what? I have the data hidden, and I'm going to show you right now how to quickly add that if that's okay.
Excellent.
Is that all right?
That's great.
I'm going to go to another tab that I had hidden, and I'm going to say unhide, data with N. So this is the same set of data, but now I get the N. So, and this is what I was saying before about some of these scores might look very high or very low, and you look at how many different people responded, and it adds more context. So I know I have that data there right now. I'm going to go back into my chart. I'm going to click anywhere in this chart area, and then again, I love right mouse click, select data, and I am going to add a data item. Series name, I'm going to go over here and I'm going to say N, and then series values. I'm going to go into that sheet, I'm going to highlight that, and then this is it's going to be the same axis, so I'm going to click on that, and I'll go back over here, and so it's the same month. Highlight that. Say OK. So what it just added, see, it's erratic and it looks crazy. Click on that new set of data, because now don't forget, we're looking at a sample size. We're not looking at scores. Right mouse click on it and say Format Data Series, Secondary Access. So now what you'll see is, see these numbers here? That's the N. So now let's take this again, right mouse click. We're going to say change series type. We're going to make it a bar. Ooh, that's not what I meant to do. Change series type. We're going to make it a column. That's what I meant to do. Highlight it one more time. Format data series. Fill. Let's make it a light gray, or maybe a little darker, and then let's make it a little bit transparent. So now what you've got, and it might look a little bit crazier, you might want to get rid of a few control limits, but now charted on the right, that bar represents the number of people, the N that responded. So this is a line and bar graph. So this is a way to add that level of the population, like the number. So you see, like, if you look at the two highest spikes in this, the 2 times the score goes over 80, look at the gray bar that lines up with those data points. You know, when it happens to be 2 months that have lower than average number of people that responded.
Great. That's excellent. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Do we have any other questions? We just have a couple of more minutes, and I don't have any questions in the chat. So if there are no other questions, we'll go ahead and wrap up.
Thank you, everyone, for letting me do this again. It was a pleasure.
Thank you.
I love talking about this stuff.
Very much.
Great job, Brian.
Thank you.
Brian. Just a reminder, everybody.
Thank you. Please stand by.